So, I'd like to talk for a few minutes today. Uh, First of all, by laying a foundation of a question that I learned to ask myself, which has actually changed my life. And it's a question I think we should all be asking ourselves from time to time. And it takes a little bit of courage, first of all, to ask the question, and then a little bit more courage than that, and a little bit of work to answer it. But if we do answer this question, and I think what we're going to find out for the most part is that in the short term, it makes life a little bit harder, but in the long term, it has payoffs that are an enormous blessing. And the question is this: what if I'm wrong? What if what I have come to believe, uh, what if my worldview, my status quo, my religious doctrines and beliefs, and so forth, what if some of these things are wrong? And the problem is, as human beings, we tend to dig in and fight for our status quo. Anytime somebody challenges what we believe, our first response is to be defensive. What if we actually step back and take a look at these things and say, okay, what if I'm actually wrong about this? And then have the courage to do the research and check it out. I want to talk today about the world we live in and the wars and the rumors of wars that Jesus warns us about in the Bible. And I want to start, this will be a short video. I don't think it's going to run more than 10 minutes, but I want to start with a quotation from a book that was written back in 1981 by a fellow named Jacques Attali. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Jacques Attali, who was an advisor uh, to French President Mitterrand uh, back in the day. And this is what he wrote. This is a political guy and a political advisor. Um, he wrote this in 1981, and this is what he had to say. In the future, it will be a question of finding a way to reduce the population. We will start with the old man, because once he's over 60 to 65 years old, man lives longer than he produces, and it costs society dearly. Then the weak, and then the useless who do not contribute anything to society, because there will be more and more, and especially, finally, the stupid. Euthanasia directed at these groups, euthanasia must be an essential instrument of our future societies in all cases. Of course, we will not be able to execute people or organize camps. We will get rid of them by making them believe that it is for their own good. Too large a population, and for the most part unnecessary, is something economically too expensive. Socially, it is also much better for the human machine to stop abruptly rather than gradually deteriorate. We won't be able to pass intelligence tests on millions and millions of people, you can imagine. We will find something or cause it, a pandemic that targets certain people, a real economic crisis or not, a virus that will affect the old or the elderly. It does not matter. The weak and the fearful will succumb. The stupid will believe it and ask to be treated. We will have taken care of having planned the treatment, a treatment that will be the solution. The selection of idiots will therefore be done by itself. They will go to the slaughterhouse alone. This is excerpt from the book, A Brief History of the Future, which quotes this guy, and the book was actually published in 2006. I bring this up because many of us, particularly those of us who have been blessed to live in America and the United States, believe that we have been a force for good and for morality and for God and for freedom and for democracy. I'm 76 years old now. I grew up in the baby boom generation, which was probably the most blessed generation in the history of the planet, from material standpoint and security and so forth. And instilled in me and most of my contemporaries were certain values, a Judeo-Christian ethic that believes in God, believes in right and wrong, believes in a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and believes in our foundational documents. These are all good and noble ideals in my judgment, and I try and live them out. But here's the problem. What if those ideals, those traditions, those firmly held beliefs have been fed and manipulated by forces behind the scenes that we've had no control over, and for the most part, no knowledge or understanding of? I want to talk about this in the context of the wars that the United States has been engaged in for the last century or better. There's a couple elements that run as themes through virtually every use of the force of arms by the United States since at least the Spanish-American War in 1898. Those two elements are this: you create a narrative that the other guy is evil. They're evil people, evil forces doing evil things. Once you've created and built up that narrative, then you need a trigger event to launch public opinion behind you to go to war and take out your enemy. In the Spanish-American War, Spain was our enemy. We painted them as being an interloper in the Western Hemisphere, even though they'd been here for hundreds of years. We painted them as slave masters and as a force that was suppressing the population of Cuba, which they may or may not have been doing. We painted that narrative over a period of time, and then the trigger for that war was the sinking of an American battleship in the Cuban harbor. And the consequent slogan, "Remember the Maine," which whipped up popular opinion in support of a war against Spain. It's even better if you can trigger the other guy to declare war on you, which is what happened in World War II. It turns out there was a memo written by a colonel, I believe an intelligence officer in our military. It was a memo to our president at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, listing 8 points that if we do this, if we do these 8 things, we can trigger Japan into launching a war against us. And those points were adopted, including, for example, moving the American Pacific Fleet from its base in California to Pearl Harbor. We knew, it turns out, we'd been monitoring Japanese radio traffic and codes for forever prior to that war starting. We knew when the attack was coming, where it was coming, and we moved our aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor to save them and sent them on missions elsewhere, and then told our military to stand down and not fire the first shot. This is now documented. Now, whether Roosevelt was right or wrong in getting us into the war, The facts on the ground were that about 90% of the population of America didn't want any part of World War II until Pearl Harbor. So we had a narrative that the Japanese are bad, and we had a trigger incident in Pearl Harbor. And there's documentation on all this now. I'm not just blowing smoke. In World War I, it was the trigger event was the assassination of the Archduke. And the trigger event for us entering the war was the sinking of the merchant ship Lusitania with a cost of some hundreds of American lives on it, despite the fact that Germany had been stopping civilian ships and searching them for munitions, and then letting them proceed if they weren't carrying armaments to the other side. They did not do that to the Lusitania because apparently there was just too much traffic going out there, and they warned us, if there's munitions on these ships, we're going to have to sink them. So we knew it was coming. Getting back to the Maine, there was an explosion which sunk our ship. There was an investigation which said it came from an outside source, and tried to pin it on Spain. The problem with that investigation was it was done by the American military. And when Spain protested and said, we'd like an independent investigation on this, they were ignored. And we went to war and took Cuba from them, established a military base there at Guantanamo, and also sent our Admiral Dewey into the Philippines, which was controlled by Spain at the time, and thought, as long as we're here, we may as well take the Philippines too. So we did that against the Filipino population's better judgment, because they started fighting us then, and that cost an estimated 200,000 civilian lives while we were over there trying to establish peace on our terms in the Philippines. This is all accurate history if we care to look for it. We can move forward to Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin. JFK did two things, probably three things, which got him killed. He went out after the mafia, which helped get him elected. They didn't like that. And also the mafia and our CIA was involved in trying to overthrow Castro so they could get the casinos and drug trade up and running again on their terms. And JFK refused to support the Bay of Pigs, which created a lot of enemies, both in organized crime and on our own CIA. And then the final straw, of course, was he announced that he was pulling us out of Vietnam. We were not going to get engaged in a war that we couldn't win over there. And so his head was blown off, and the evidence on the table now, and there's lots of it, is that it was our government that took him out, using the CIA in collaboration or partnership with the mafia. And that seemed to have been a partnership that goes back at least to the Second World War. So I wanted to talk about this to suggest to you that our government is not representing our interests. We haven't really won a war since World War II. Our tendency is to go to war, make a lot of money for a lot of people, bankers and industrialists and so forth. And then when we've done all we could profit-wise, turn and walk away. We can look at 9/11, and if you're willing to ask yourself, what if I'm wrong about these terrorists taking down those towers, that leads to a whole can of worms, one of which is skyscrapers like that have never collapsed from an airplane hit. Those were all steel frame buildings. They collapsed right into their own footprint, and Building 7 wasn't hit by anything. What brought it down and why? And then within a matter of a couple of weeks, we have the Patriot Act passed, which basically stripped us of our constitutional rights and gave the president the right to go to war anywhere he wanted in the name of fighting terrorism, which he was quoted as saying could be an almost endless war. This is going to go on for a long time. Since that time, we launched wars in the Middle East, all over the Middle East, and haven't bothered to win any. We abandoned Afghanistan when it no longer served our interests. And if you question why we left 40 or 50 billion dollars worth of armaments in Afghanistan and abandoned our so-called allies and just turned and walked away, leaving all that merchandise behind, I would suggest to you that somebody's going to make a whole lot of money by replacing those armaments and rebuilding our military. The same goes on in Ukraine. We've been funding a losing proposition in Ukraine, propping up a government which the United States State Department put in place in 2014 after the Maidan massacre, which we participated in, and our so-called diplomats with the State Department are on record and were quoted by two former officials of Ukraine as stating that we need to see more dead bodies in this so-called revolt against the existing government to build up enough propaganda that the United States can come out in support of a regime change. So we put this regime in place. We've fed about $100 billion into Ukraine now. The entire nation is utterly devastated. We had no business there. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. They border Russia, and Russia said, we're not going to accept nuclear weapons on our border any more than you would have accepted them in Cuba. And so we forced Putin into a corner, and he now came in and he's protecting Russia and Russian interests. That doesn't mean he's good or bad, but he is a nationalist. I would also suggest to you that most of that Ukraine aid is getting laundered, and a lot of it's getting filtered right back into the pockets of our politicians and corrupt officials. So I wanted to bring this up so that we can watch in the future as our government tries to take us into yet another war that we don't win, that burn out our best and noblest young people. If they're not killed or physically wounded, they come back damaged psychologically, and many of them never recovering from those mental and emotional wounds. And it's time to put a stop to this nonsense. You know, we don't have to. We're not spreading democracy. Most of these countries, by the time we're done, they hate us and wish that we would just leave them alone. And now we're at it in Israel. We've got aircraft carrier groups in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean helping Israel. Israel created an enemy out of Hamas, which they probably are. I'm sure these are not nice people. But they painted a picture of these evil Palestinians. They knew this attack was coming. They stood down and let it happen and didn't respond for 7 hours, despite the fact that this was the most secure border on earth. If you look at the border with Gaza, it's concrete wall, barbed wire, motion detecting cameras and pillboxes and security all the way along it, all of which stood down while these attacks happened. And it was then used as a pretext that these Hamas people are the most evil people on earth. And in order to protect Israel by wiping them out, we're going to have to take out Gaza. If you look at some aerial photographs of what Israel has done to Gaza since October 7th, it looks worse than Hiroshima after a nuclear bomb. They're killing massive civilians, and they're intent on driving the population out of there. Some of these Palestinians, by the way, are Christians. One of the hospitals that Israel took down was a Baptist hospital, and they've now managed to turn the entire Arab world against them. This is not going to end well, and it's particularly not going to end well for the United States if we get engaged in yet another foreign war. I bring this up so that we can all start looking for this pattern. You create a narrative of an evil enemy, and then you set up a trigger event to get public opinion behind you, and then you go to war. And the way we wage war is ugly. The head of the snake right now is the American government, which it does not represent the American people. These people were installed, they weren't elected. We have a permanent bureaucracy that we can't unwind or unravel. And it's time as Americans that we ask ourselves the simple question, what if I'm wrong? What if the things I've been led to believe are not true? It's almost certain that 9/11 was an inside job, whether we want to believe that or not, conducted by our own government against our own people as a pretext for going to endless war in the Middle East and elsewhere. People are getting rich off this, and they're taking our values, the things we hold dear, which is freedom and godliness and justice, and they've twisted them and manipulated them in the background, and they're manipulating us, and it's time to stand up. So that's my rant for today. And if you want to challenge anything I'm saying here, I built a website. It's called trueheart.net, truheart.net. And that's kind of my personal library where I put all my supporting information from the research I've done on these things. So if you're still watching, thank you for watching.